The mist had crept in thicker than usual that Christmas Eve, curling like ghostly tendrils through the narrow gaps between rows of towering pines. Mike Thompson zipped his coat higher against the biting cold, his breath spiraling in silver clouds as he trudged across the muddy earth of the Everest Christmas tree farm. He was used to early mornings and late nights here. Ever since his return a few months ago, the work had been grueling but grounding, something he needed after the chaos of the past year. But tonight the world felt wrong. The faint glow from the farmhouse behind him barely cut through the mist now, leaving Mike surrounded by endless rows of dark, silent trees. He had just come out to check on a late delivery of twine left near the barn. Nothing unusual, except this cold. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just winter cold. It clung to him, thick and unforgiving, and beneath it, Mike swore he could hear something. A faint rustle, a whisper, carried on the damp wind. He stopped walking. Ahead, a shadow moved between the rows of trees. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a trick of the light. The figure was tall and gaunt, on its edges blurred as though it were half-formed, yet undeniably human. It moved silently, gliding through the mist, its shape becoming clearer as it passed between the trees. Mike's heart pounded in his ears, loud and thunderous against the stillness. "Hey, who's there?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, cutting through the cold air. No answer. The figure slowed, almost pausing, but it didn't turn toward him. Instead, it continued its steady glide, its head tilted just slightly downward, as though searching for something. Mike felt his throat tighten as he strained to make out the details. An old coat that billowed slightly, a slouching gait, a faint impression of sunken features that might have been a face. Before, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure melted into the mist, disappearing without a sound. The air hung heavy. Mike's feet felt rooted to the ground. "Mike!" A voice called from behind, Sarah's, distant but concerned. The suddenness of it made him flinch. He turned sharply, realizing only then that he'd been holding his breath. When he glanced back toward where the figure had been, there was nothing but mist, thick and endless. The Everest Christmas tree farm was a beautiful place by day. Families came from all over the county to pick out their trees, sip cocoa, and take holiday photos. Rows of pristine pines stretched for acres, each standing tall like sentinels of Christmas joy. To the casual visitor, it was idyllic, a staple of the community's holiday tradition. But at night, the farm felt different. The mist seemed to rise from the earth itself, a living thing that wrapped everything in silence and shadow. The cheerful rows of trees became ominous. The isolation of the place, nestled on the edge of dense woods, suddenly oppressive. Even the cheery lights strung along the farmhouse porch couldn't pierce through the murky gloom. Mike had spent countless Christmases here as a kid. His parents had run the farm until they retired, passing it on to him with little fanfare. He remembered the laughter, the carols, the joy. This place had meant something. But tonight, that warmth was a distant memory, buried under the weight of something else. Sarah was the first to say it out loud a few nights ago. "Mike, does the farm feel off to you?" She'd been standing by the window, gazing into the dark fields, arms wrapped around herself like she couldn't shake the chill. He'd brushed it off. What else could it be but nerves? Or maybe exhaustion? They were both still settling into life here again after everything. But now Mike wasn't so sure. Mike shook himself from his thoughts and hurried back toward the farmhouse, forcing his legs to move. The distant glow from the porch lights seemed too far away, as if the mist was swallowing it whole. "Just the cold getting to me," he muttered under his breath, though his voice didn't carry far. As he reached the farmhouse door, Sarah was waiting there, her face drawn with quiet worry. "Did you see something?" Mike paused, his hand still on the doorknob. "No, just my eyes playing tricks." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. From behind them, the wind picked up, a low sigh that rattled the farmhouse windows. Mike turned back, squinting into the night. For a moment, just barely, he thought he saw something move again, a shadow slipping silently between the trees. The morning after that unsettling Christmas Eve encounter, Mike awoke to the kind of silence that felt too heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Sarah had already gotten up, leaving a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Mike sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing the stiffness from his neck, the memory of that shadow lingering like a fog in his mind. Just my eyes playing tricks. He told himself again, but the doubt gnawed at him. Mike's day started as any other. Chores were waiting, customers would arrive soon, kids in colorful scarves running between the trees, parents negotiating over the perfect Christmas tree. He threw himself into the work, hoping the physical labor would quiet his thoughts. But the farm was different now. The mist had lingered longer than usual, stubbornly clinging to the far end of the property where the oldest, tallest trees stood. No matter how brightly the sun shone, the mist hung there like a warning. Jake Miller, Mike's old friend and now right-hand man at the farm, noticed it too. "You see that?" Jake said, pointing his axe toward the far edge of the lot. "Damn fog hasn't lifted all morning." Mike paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Probably the weather, temperature shift or something." Jake grunted, unconvinced. "Sure, just saying, feels wrong, you know? Like it's sitting there watching us." Mike didn't respond, but the words stuck to him. Watching. He'd felt it too, eyes somewhere in the mist, though he knew there was nothing there, or so he told himself. By late afternoon, as the last family loaded their tree into a truck and drove off, the day turned grayer. Sarah found Mike near the barn, hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring toward the mist-covered trees. "You're doing it again," she said softly, coming up beside him. "Doing what?" "Looking for something that isn't there." Mike hesitated. "You've felt it too." Sarah's gaze dropped to her hands. "I keep hearing things at night, Mike. Footsteps, whispers. I'll look outside, but there's no one there. Just the mist." Mike frowned, his stomach nodding. He hadn't told her about the shadowy figure. He hadn't wanted to worry her. "It's just an old farm, Sarah. Old places make weird noises." She nodded but didn't look convinced. "Maybe, but I can't shake it. Like something's close." That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Mike found himself awake again. The farmhouse was dark, but something pulled him from sleep. A sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was faint but steady, like boots walking across frozen ground. Mike sat up, heart racing. The noise wasn't inside, it was coming from outside the window, moving slowly toward the front porch. He glanced at Sarah, still sleeping soundly, and swung his legs over the bed. Downstairs, the house was eerily still. Mike grabbed the flashlight by the door, the beam cutting weakly into the heavy mist. He stepped onto the porch, cold air biting his skin. "Hello?" His voice carried only a few feet before the fog swallowed it whole. He swept the light over the yard. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the silence and the mist rolling like smoke. But then, the beam landed on the edge of the trees, and his breath caught. A figure stood there. The same gaunt shape, its outline blurred by the mist. This time it was closer. The head tilted slightly as though looking at him, but it didn't move. It just stood there. "Who are you?" Mike called, his voice hoarse. No response. The figure took a single step forward and Mike stumbled back, his flashlight dropping. By the time he snatched it up and shone the beam again, the figure was gone, replaced by the dense, swirling fog. Behind him, the farmhouse door creaked open. Sarah stood there, pale, clutching her robe tightly around her arm. "What's going on?" Mike turned to her, his voice low. "Someone's out there." She shook her head slowly. "I told you, it's something, Mike, not someone." The next morning, unable to shake the night's events, Mike drove into town. He hadn't spoken to Emily Davis, the town's self-appointed historian, in years, but if anyone knew about the farm's past, it was her. The library was nearly empty when he found her at her usual table, surrounded by books and old maps. "Michael Thompson," she said, pushing her glasses up. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Mike hesitated. "Maybe I have." He recounted the last few days, the mist, the noises, the shadow in the trees. Emily's expression hardened, and she closed the book in front of her with a soft thud. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "Years ago, a man disappeared on that farm, a farmer. Some say he wandered into the mist on Christmas Eve and never came back. No body, no answers." Mike frowned. "What happened to him?" Emily glanced at him over her glasses. "No one knows, but the stories say he's still there, lost in the mist, searching for something. And until he finds it, he'll wander. That farm holds secrets, Michael, secrets that families bury." Mike felt the weight of her words settle over him like a stone. "What do you mean, families bury?" Emily looked at him carefully, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You should ask your father about that farm. The drive back to the farm felt longer than it should have. Emily's words rang in Mike's head. That farm holds secrets, Michael. Secrets that families bury. What did she mean? What was his father hiding? The trees lining the road seemed to close in on him, their tall shapes lost in the ever-present mist that had begun spreading farther into town. The fog no longer seemed confined to the farm, as if it had taken root, creeping outward like a shadow. When Mike pulled into the driveway, Sarah was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, her face pinched with worry. "Where were you?" "Needed some answers," Mike muttered, brushing past her. "Answers?" She followed him inside. "From who?" Mike set his keys on the table, his tone flat. "Emily Davis. She told me about a man who went missing on this farm. Christmas Eve, decades ago. Never found." Sarah stared at him, her voice low. "Mike, what does that have to do with us?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a box of old records his parents had left in the attic after they retired. He dragged it down into the living room, dust puffing into the air as he set it on the floor. "Mike, stop!" Sarah's voice trembled. "Why does this matter?" "Because Emily said it's buried, our family. This place, it's not just the farm, Sarah, it's us." Mike spent hours rifling through papers, receipts, photos, contracts, anything that might hold a clue. The farmhouse walls seemed to close in as night fell, the light from the single lamp flickering weakly. Finally, at the bottom of the box, he found it, a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline made his throat go dry. Mike's eyes widened. James Thompson, his grandfather. He dropped into the chair, the room spinning around him. "My granddad," he whispered, staring at the photo, grainy and faded, of a tall man in an old coat, standing in front of the farmhouse. The same coat Mike thought he'd seen on the figure in the mist. Sarah sat down beside him, her voice hushed. "Mike, why wouldn't your dad ever tell you this?" Mike shook his head. "I don't know. I didn't even know his name. My dad never talked about him. It was like he didn't exist." From outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Both of them flinched at the sound. Then it came again. Thump, thump, thump. Steady footsteps moving across the front porch. Mike froze. Sarah gripped his arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, blood rushing in his ears. The footsteps stopped. Then, 3 slow knocks on the front door. Mike rose, his heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. He hesitated at the door, then swung it open. Nothing. Just the mist, swirling heavier now, as though it had weight. But when Mike lowered the flashlight beam, his breath hitched. In the mud at the foot of the porch, there were footprints. Large, deliberate boot prints leading up to the door, but no sign of anyone who could have made them. The tracks stopped as if the figure had simply vanished. That night, the farmhouse became a prison of sound. Mike lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Sarah tossed beside him, restless. From outside came noises, faint whispers threading through the mist, too low to make out but unmistakably voices. They rose and fell like a chorus, each word distorted, as though someone or something was trying to speak but couldn't quite form the words. Around midnight, Sarah shot up in bed, gasping. "Did you hear that?" Mike bolted upright. "What?" She turned to him, eyes wide, her face pale. "It said your name." Mike stared at her. "The whispers," she breathed. "I heard them. They said Michael." At dawn, Mike knew they couldn't keep pretending. He and Sarah went straight to Jake, explaining what had been happening. Jake listened, chewing on his lip, his skepticism faltering for the first time. "You're telling me you think your grandfather's out there?" Jake said finally, his voice low. Mike shook his head. "I don't know, but something is. It's tied to my family. My dad never talked about him, never even told me his name. But now it's like..." "Like what?" Jake pressed. "Like he's calling to me." Jake sighed and scratched his chin. "So what now? You gonna go out there and ask him what he wants?" Mike didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. That afternoon, as the sun began to sink, Mike stood at the edge of the farm, staring into the mist-covered rows of trees. He knew it was waiting for him. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Mike, don't go out there." "I have to," he said quietly. "If I don't, this isn't going to stop. I need to know." She shook her head. "What if you don't come back?" He looked at her, then toward the mist. "I will." The trees loomed ahead like dark sentinels as Mike stepped into the fog, flashlight in hand. The air was deathly cold. With each step, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him. His name, Michael, rose and fell, carried on the wind. Then he saw it. The figure stood ahead, half obscured by the mist. Its coat billowed faintly, its head bowed as if waiting. Mike's flashlight shook. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The figure raised its head. For the first time, Mike saw its face, pale, hollow, and sunken, but unmistakably human. It looked just like the photo of his grandfather. The mist swallowed Mike whole, stretching the familiar rows of trees into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was pulling him back, trying to keep him from going further. His flashlight beam cut through the fog, but revealed nothing except the eerie silence of the farm. Then he heard it, a faint shuffling, just ahead. Mike's breaths came shallow. "Grandpa," he whispered, though his voice sounded wrong here, small and hollow. The figure stood motionless in the clearing between the trees. It was closer now, the details of its gaunt face clearer. His flashlight trembled as it hit the figure's sunken eyes that seemed impossibly deep, as if looking into them would pull him under. "Who are you? Mike choked out, his voice a mix of terror and desperation. The figure didn't move. Instead, a sound filled the clearing, a wet, rattling breath, as though the figure were trying to speak. Then came a whisper that didn't come from its mouth but from all around him. "Michael, come." The voice was distorted, broken by static-like crackles, but it was unmistakably calling his name. "Why are you here?" Mike demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The figure raised one skeletal hand slowly, deliberately, pointing toward the farthest end of the farm, where the oldest trees grew in a forgotten grove, a place no one ever went. Mike's body felt like it was moving on its own as he pushed through the mist, past rows of perfectly trimmed Christmas trees, until the farm itself seemed to change. Here, the trees were different, ancient, gnarled pines with twisted branches that clawed at the sky. The air felt colder, heavier, as if this part of the farm had been untouched for decades. Ahead, the ground sloped gently downward, and Mike's flashlight flickered as he came to a stop. At the center of the grove stood an old, collapsed well, its wooden frame rotted and splintered, long forgotten. A foul smell rose from it, damp and metallic, making Mike cover his nose. His flashlight faltered again, the beam wavering before finally settling on something at the edge of the well, an old boot, half buried in the dirt, its leather cracked and weathered by time. Mike's stomach dropped. He knew that boot. He'd seen it in the grainy photo of his grandfather, James Thompson. He stepped closer, the whispering wind rising into a frenzy around him. His name, Michael, echoing with every gust. "Is this where you are?" Mike whispered, staring into the well's black abyss. "Did you fall?" The wind stopped. Everything stopped. For the first time, the world felt still. Then the flashlight beam illuminated something deeper in the well, a hand, skeletal, twisted, reaching up from the shadows. Mike stumbled back, a scream caught in his throat. The mist surged around Mike, thick and suffocating, as the world seemed to spin. He fell to his knees, gripping the frozen earth, and then he saw it, not with his eyes, but somewhere deeper, as if its fist itself were showing him. It was Christmas Eve long ago. His grandfather, James Thompson, stood at the edge of this same grove, clutching an old lantern. The farm was smaller then, the trees sparser. James looked anxious, his breath visible in the cold air as he searched for something or someone. From the shadows came another man, faceless, a silhouette in the mist. Mike watched helplessly as they argued, their muffled voices rising. Then there was a shove. James stumbled backward, his boot catching the edge of the well. His lantern fell first, disappearing into the darkness before James himself tumbled after it. The vision flickered, like a scratched film reel. James's scream echoed through the grove, cut short by the sickening sound of impact. Then silence. Mike gasped, the vision vanishing as quickly as it came. The grove was dark again, and the wind returned, howling like an anguished cry. Mike sat there, trembling, as the truth sank in. His grandfather hadn't disappeared. He died here, fallen into this well, forgotten for generations. The farm had hidden his fate beneath the mist, the trees growing up around it like a shroud. But who was the shadowed figure that had pushed him? "Who did this to you?" Mike whispered into the void, his voice hoarse. "What am I supposed to do?" The wind shifted, carrying a single word back to him, faint and brittle. "Remember." Suddenly, Mike understood. The spirit, his grandfather, wasn't just searching for peace. He was trying to reveal a truth that someone had buried. Someone who'd kept the farm. Someone in his own family. The mist swirled around the well, a low groan rising from the earth itself, as though the farm were waking up. The whispers grew louder again, angrier, repeating his name. Michael. By the time Mike stumbled back to the farmhouse, dawn was breaking, but the mist remained thick as ever. Sarah met him at the door, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Where were you?" she whispered. "I've been looking for you for hours." Mike slumped into the chair, his clothes damp with sweat and mist. "I found him, Sarah. My grandfather. He's been here the whole time." Sarah stared at him, her hand covering her mouth. "Mike." He looked up at her, his expression haunted. Someone pushed him. Someone covered it up. Behind them, the house groaned, the sound like wood under pressure. Sarah's eyes darted to the ceiling. "What's happening?" Mike stood, his pulse quickening. The mist had begun seeping through the cracks, around the windows and doors, curling inside the house like smoke. The farm wasn't done with them yet. The farmhouse felt like it was breathing. The mist seeped into every crack and corner, a living thing curling along the floorboards like silent serpents. Mike paced back and forth, his mind racing with the revelation from the grove. His grandfather hadn't vanished. He'd been killed. Someone had pushed James Thompson into that well all those years ago, and the farm had hidden the secret under layers of mist, silence, and generations of denial. Sarah sat in the corner, clutching a blanket around her, wide-eyed. "Mike, what do we do? The farm, it's alive, it's angry." He stopped pacing, looking at her. "We need answers, real answers. My dad knew something, he had to." Mike pulled out his phone and dialed his father's number. It rang endlessly before the voice on the other end picked up, groggy, annoyed, and distant. "Mike, it's early. What's going on?" "Dad," Mike's voice was shaking. "I need to know about Grandpa James, about the farm." There was a beat of silence. Then, "Why are you bringing that up now?" "Because I found him," Mike snapped. "I found the well, Dad. He's been here this whole time. He's haunting the farm." Another long silence. Then his father's voice returned, strained, trembling. "Mike, you don't know what you're talking about. Leave it alone." "I can't," Mike shouted into the phone. You knew what happened to him and you buried it. Why? Who pushed him? Who covered it up?" His father's voice came back, low and broken. "It wasn't an accident, Mike, but it wasn't what you think. The farm, it does things to people. It always has. Your grandfather tried to leave, but the farm wouldn't let him." "What are you saying?" Mike whispered, his blood running cold. "The farm claimed him, Mike, just like it'll claim you if you don't stop digging." Click. The line went dead. The moment Mike put the phone down, the farmhouse shook. It wasn't an earthquake. No, it felt deeper, as though something beneath the house was straining against the earth itself. Sarah screamed as the lights flickered wildly, bulbs buzzing and shattering. The mist outside thickened, pressing against the windows like hands trying to claw their way inside. The whispers returned, hundreds of voices now, layered and frantic, rising into a chaotic chorus. Mike grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We have to go!" But as they stepped onto the porch, the scene outside froze them both. The mist had swallowed the entire farm. Rows of trees stretched endlessly, their branches twisted and bare despite the season. And standing between those trees, dozens of shadowy figures. They were still, unmoving, like an audience waiting for a show to begin. Among them, Mike saw one figure more distinct than the others. His grandfather, James Thompson, standing at the front, his hollow gaze locked on Mike. The whispers converged, a single word cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Remember." Mike staggered forward, the shadows watching silently as he approached the grove once more. The well was waiting, its darkness yawning like an open mouth. Sarah clutched his sleeve, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Mike, don't." "I have to," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's the only way this ends." As he knelt beside the well, the whispers turned into words, clear and deafening. He didn't fall, he was pushed. By blood, by kin. Mike's hands trembled on the edge of the rotted wood. "My father?" The mist swirled violently, and the figures between the trees seemed to inch closer. A memory, not his own, but something passed down, forced its way into his mind. It was the night of the tragedy. His father, a boy then, had followed James into the grove. James had planned to leave the farm, sell it, abandon its traditions. But something wouldn't let him. The farm wouldn't let him. In a moment of blind panic, or perhaps the farm's influence, Mike's father shoved James, the scream, the lantern's light disappearing, the dull thud, and then silence. The truth had been buried ever since. Mike fell to his knees, his breath ragged. He knew, my father knew, and he let the farm hide it. Sarah knelt beside him, her voice soft. What do we do, Mike? He turned to her, his face pale but resolute. We finish it. We end this. Mike stood at the edge of the well, looking into its black abyss. You want justice, don't you? You want to be remembered. The wind howled, carrying James's voice. Yes. Mike grabbed the flashlight and turned back to Sarah. Get the lanterns, the old ones from the barn. We're burning this grove down. The grove was alive. As Mike and Sarah pulled the old, rusted lanterns from the barn, the mist thickened into a wall of suffocating gray, wrapping around the farm like an impenetrable shroud. From somewhere deep within, the whispering voices grew louder, sharper, a frantic chorus that echoed like screams distorted on the wind. Mike worked quickly, filling the lanterns with oil, his hands trembling but steady enough. Sarah stood watch, clutching a box of matches, flinching every time the farmhouse groaned under the weight of the mist. It knows what we're doing, she whispered. I don't care, Mike said, his voice tight. It ends tonight. The ground felt soft beneath their feet as they approached the grove. The oldest trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisting and reaching for them, their bark blackened and gnarled as if scarred by something unspeakable. The well stood at the center like a gaping wound, and beyond it the figures waited. Dozens of them, shadowy shapes that had once been people, their edges blurred, their faces hollow. The whispers swelled as Mike stepped forward, lantern in hand. They weren't attacking or moving. They were watching. James Thompson stood at the front of the crowd, his hollow eyes fixed on Mike, his skeletal hand raised, pointing at the well. You want justice, Mike said, his voice echoing in the heavy silence. You want the truth to come out. The wind surged around him in answer. Mike turned to Sarah. Light the lanterns. Sarah struck the first match, her hands trembling as the flame flared to life. One by one they lit the lanterns, the golden glow casting flickering shadows across the grove. For the first time, the mist seemed to recoil from the light, the ghostly shapes wavering as though weakened by its presence. Mike placed the first lantern at the base of a twisted pine, the oil-soaked wick catching quickly. The flames licked upward, the fire crackling hungrily. The grove screamed. The wind howled, carrying with it a terrible sound, like hundreds of voices shrieking in unison. The shadowy figures began to move, their outlines pulsing with anger. The mist surged forward, fighting the flames, swirling violently as though trying to smother the fire. Keep going, Mike shouted over the deafening roar. They lit another tree, then another. The grove was ablaze now, flames devouring the ancient pines. Sparks rained down like fireflies, and the heat grew unbearable. But the figures kept coming, closer, angrier, their faces contorting into expressions of rage and despair. At the center of it all, James Thompson's spirit remained. The fire reflected in his hollow eyes, his figure wavering but stronger, more distinct than before. Mike staggered toward the well, shouting over the roar of the flames. What do you want? This is what you wanted, isn't it? You want them to know what happened. The figure of James tilted its head, the skeletal hand reaching toward Mike. Not them, you. The ground trembled. Mike stumbled back as the truth struck him like a fist. The farm didn't just want justice, it wanted him. It wanted blood, a sacrifice, the same way it had claimed his grandfather. Mike! Sarah screamed, pulling at his arm as the fire swirled around them. It's not going to let you go. The shadowy figures surged forward, the mist coiling around them like smoke drawn toward the fire. Mike's head spun, the flames and screams merging into a dizzying blur. No, he growled, pulling Sarah with him. No more, you hear me? No more. Mike grabbed the lantern he'd kept for last and stepped to the edge of the well. The heat from the flames scorched his skin, the mist curling angrily around his ankles, as if trying to pull him in. The figures closed in, their hollow faces stretching into silent screams. With every ounce of strength, Mike raised the lantern over the well. You don't own us. Not anymore. He hurled the lantern down. The glass shattered, and a bright burst of flame erupted from the depths. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind went silent, the shadows froze, and the mist itself seemed to scream, a raw, inhuman sound that shook the earth. Then the fire roared upward, a pillar of light that tore through the mist. The figures convulsed, their outlines flickering and breaking apart like ash scattered in the wind. James Thompson's spirit lingered a moment longer, his hollow gaze fixed on Mike. Then with a faint, almost grateful nod, he dissolved into the light. The mist began to retreat, thinning as the fire consumed the grove. The trees crackled and splintered, falling into ash as the flame spread. The figures were gone, the whispers silenced. By the time the fire died down, the grove was nothing but charred earth and smoldering stumps. The well, too, had collapsed into itself, a scar left where the farm's darkest secret had been buried. Mike and Sarah stood together, covered in soot and sweat, breathing hard. "It's over," Sarah whispered, though her voice trembled. Mike nodded, staring at the ruins of the grove. "Yeah, it's over." As the first light of dawn crept through the remaining mist, the farm felt different, lighter. The weight that had lingered for generations was gone, burned away with the truth. But as they turned to leave, Mike stopped. A single whisper, faint, almost a sigh, rose on the wind. "Thank you." He glanced back at the ruins of the grove. There was nothing left but silence. For now. The sun had fully risen by the time Mike and Sarah stumbled back toward the farmhouse. Their bodies sore, their clothes smeared with ash and soot. The mist was gone. Not just thin, gone. The air felt clearer, sharper, like the weight that had loomed over the Everest Christmas tree farm for decades had been lifted. Mike paused at the edge of the porch, turning to look back at the land. The grove was nothing but blackened earth now, smoke still curling weakly from the ruins. The well was gone, collapsed and buried beneath the smoldering remains. The tall, proud rows of Christmas trees swayed gently in the breeze, no longer ominous. For the first time in weeks, the farm felt like a farm. Sarah slid her hand into his. "It's over, Mike. It's really over." Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah." But he didn't smile. Later that morning, after showering off the grime and smoke, Mike sat on the front porch with a steaming mug of coffee. His father's words still haunted him. "The farm does things to people. It always has." He picked up the phone and dialed again. This time, his father answered on the first ring. "Mike?" "It's done," Mike said. "The grove, the well, it's gone." The silence on the other end stretched longer than it should have. Finally, his father spoke, his voice uneven. "I never wanted you to find out." "You knew," Mike said flatly. "You knew he didn't just vanish. You let us grow up here like nothing happened." His father exhaled heavily, a sound that bordered on a sob. "I thought burying it would keep it quiet, keep it gone. But it never left, Mike. The farm remembers." Mike frowned, his hand tightening around the phone. "It's over now, the fire ended it." Another pause, then, "Maybe." Mike froze. "What do you mean, maybe?" His father's voice dropped to a whisper. "The farm takes what it's owed, Mike. Sometimes fire doesn't erase it. Sometimes it just makes it wait." The line went dead. Mike and Sarah packed their things that afternoon. It didn't feel right to stay anymore. Not after what had happened. "I don't want the farm," Mike told Sarah as they loaded the car. "Not after this." She nodded. "What will you do with it?" "Sell it, let someone else decide what it's worth." Mike's voice was cold, final. The farm had been in his family for generations, but he wouldn't let it pull him back. The shadows, the whispers, they were gone now. They had to be. They climbed into the car and Mike turned the key. As the engine rumbled to life, he looked one last time at the house. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a shadow move past one of the upstairs windows, a dark shape, there and gone. He blinked and shook his head. Just my imagination. The tires crunched over the gravel as they pulled away. As they drove down the long dirt road, leaving the farm behind, Mike gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The open fields on either side of the road were quiet, calm. Then Sarah gasped, "Mike, look!" Mike's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. From the distance, barely visible where the mist had once hung, stood the grove, charred, black, but not empty. A single pine tree had begun to grow at the center of the ruins, small but impossibly green, its needles vibrant against the ash. Mike stared, his throat dry. It was as though the farm itself had planted the tree. a fresh start, a rebirth. The whisper came so faintly it could have been the wind through the car windows, but Mike heard it clear as day. Michael. A pine needle drifted down onto the windshield. Mike didn't stop driving. Mike and Sarah left the Everest Christmas tree farm behind, but something of it would always remain. The truth had been revealed, the past laid bare, but the land was still there, waiting. The farm no longer whispered, no longer screamed, but in the silence it sat, watching, growing. Some places aren't meant to be burned. Some places can't be forgotten. And some places, remember.